Hello, YouTube connoisseurs. I am Sean Stoger, and this is Crazy Native Philosophy. This one is going to be a cage fight. Today's video is Counting Coup on Western Philosophy. This is the second video in a three-part series where we look at Native American philosophy in relation to Western academic philosophy, and ultimately I show how they do not mix. But first, I want you to imagine being in deadly combat. The enemy right in front of you is attacking you with a knife or a sword or an axe or trying to shoot you with a firearm. Instead of you trying to kill them before they kill you, you manage to slide in and pants them and then slide out before they can lay a finger on you. Now that's what's known as counting coup. Now historically, instead of pantsing somebody, we would slide in and tag them with a hand, or we'd smack them with a stick, and then we'd let out a big whoop. Now this humiliated our enemy because we were announcing that in the middle of life and death combat, that we were just toying with them. So to do this, you must have incredible skill and nuts the size of boulders to even try something like this. Now, it's one thing to take on a particular philosophical argument or even an esteemed philosopher. But right now, I'm going to take on the entire field of Western academic philosophy. I will also show that doing native philosophy in a native way is truly doing philosophy according to Western academic philosophy itself. And if I can pull this off, I will believe I will have counted coup on the entire discipline. So, hoka-hey. Now, some Western philosophers may question, is there such thing as native thought? Or how does a Native American philosophy differ from Western academic philosophy? Harsher critics might say, he's not doing philosophy. I will address these perspectives very shortly. To all the aforementioned, I will use Wikipedia's definition and description of philosophy. Now, I know someone will undoubtedly have a problem with Wikipedia, and I don't really care. I don't see the need to purchase a textbook just to prove my points. The foundational problems inherent in Western philosophy will be revealed by Wikipedia alone, and in-depth research will only contribute additional evidence to support my claims. Now, diving right in, when we go on Wikipedia, we'll scroll down, we get to a section called Conceptions of Philosophy. We see this is split into two subcategories, and those are general conception and academic conception. This is where we find what I call the conception problem. Now, the general conception has two paragraphs, and I'm going to quickly summarize those. So the general conception of philosophy is a rational investigation. It's methodical, analytical, considers the human experience and nature of reality. Its questions are generalized and fundamental. Its questions are often non-conclusive, meaning we often don't get answers. And by questioning, we understand the subject matter better, our life experience better, or our own or someone else's limitations in thinking. So we can say that these are the 7 criteria for doing work in the general conception of philosophy. They're pretty straightforward and easy to understand. So if doing native philosophy in a native way meets these 7 criteria, then technically I am doing philosophy, at least on this level. Now let's look at the academic conception of philosophy. This has 6 paragraphs, which I will summarize. Very first sentence reads, and I quote, "Attempts to provide more precise definitions of philosophy are controversial and are studied in metaphilosophy." So we have to do a little research here and see what metaphilosophy is, and metaphilosophy turns out to be the philosophy of philosophy. So this is where the train comes off the rails. So what does that mean, right? It means it explores the fundamental question of what is philosophy? So the first 5 paragraphs out of these 6 paragraphs are views and arguments over what academic philosophy could be. The 6th paragraph I personally find the most interesting, and it speaks about the original roots of philosophy. But at the bottom of that paragraph, it dismisses it as archaic because, philosophers are so much better today than they were back then, right? So to break this down even further, there is no agreement on what academic philosophy truly is. And there is an entire branch devoted to answering the question, what is it? That means there can be no criteria for doing advanced philosophical work. And so, Western academic philosophy must at the very least meet the 7 criteria of general conception, the same as anybody else, to be considered doing any philosophical work. Now to answer your questions, is there such thing as native philosophy? I will say if you are genuinely curious, you will have to watch the videos on my channel to find out. However, as an academic discipline, philosophy is foundationally ethnocentric, which I will prove by the end of this video. So I would ask, why would modern day philosophers care? As this is crazy native philosophy, I will examine Western academic philosophy's contempt for native philosophy in my next video. Now moving on to the question, how does native philosophy differ from Western academic philosophy? I guess if you want to know, you will have to seek the answers for yourself. I do native philosophy in a native way for the next generation, and I could care less about working to show native philosophy's value to academic philosophers with a storied history of ethnocentric exclusion in hopes that one day they will finally validate us as intellectual equals. Lastly, there was the criticism of he's not doing philosophy. Well, as long as I meet the 7 criteria for a general conception, I'm doing philosophy. At this juncture, I believe I have aptly shown, using Western academic philosophy itself, that Western academic philosophy really is no grander or superior than the working man's conception, or the working man's general conception of philosophy. To provide evidence that Western academic philosophy believes itself superior to others, I present the jargon problem. Again, scrolling down Wikipedia to core branches, we see it is divided up into 4 main divisions. Those divisions are epistemology, logic, ethics, and metaphysics. And, if you really want to know what those are, you can feel free to check those out for yourself. But I say there's no need. Any investigation into any one of these branches quickly begins a downward spiral into obscure philosophical terminology. And the natural question to ask is why? Why use terms that are alien and confusing to anyone who is not a Western academic philosopher? Now, in the United States military, when conventional troops are not directly engaged in a particular duty, they often put up a charade to look busy. That way their superiors or supervisors do not assign them actual work and make them actually busy. Philosophical jargon gives the outward appearance of looking busy or productivity, while confusing outsiders into thinking that Western academic philosophy is actually busy or serves some higher purpose or any purpose. When we look deeper into the Wikipedia entry, we discover that I'm not alone in this assertion. We find a section on how philosophical methods are eventually used to create philosophical theories, and the purpose of those theories are to be fought over. Now, it is also mentioned that philosophical methods are not to be confused with the scientific method. Now, the scientific method is about examining something, creating a theory, and then either proving or disproving that theory. The philosophical method is about examining something and then seeing how well it can be argued over. If we were to ask what is the end result of this, we would say that science gives us a substantial conclusion, whereas philosophy just gives us a theory. We could use the conclusions from the scientific method to build us a bridge. But philosophers design an argument to argue over its strengths and weaknesses, and its strengths and weaknesses in relation to other theories. And when all that arguing is over, the end result is arguments over theories. In other words, it's just fiction. And this is what I call the purpose problem. This bluntly brings us to the question, is what is the purpose of academic philosophy? Or how does philosophy as an academic discipline benefit society or the individual? Now, in the Wikipedia section, relation to other fields, it opens with a rather funny statement, and I quote, "Philosophy is closely related to many other fields. It is sometimes understood as a meta-discipline that clarifies their nature and limits." Now, I think the only people who must believe this are academic philosophers. I wonder if we were to ask someone like Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson if the astrophysics department on his campus ever runs over to the philosophy department to get clarification on the nature and limits of astrophysics. I can say I have never seen nor heard of this ever happening on any of the campuses I've ever known or worked on. Departments stay pretty isolated, and everyone does their own thing. Now, just to be thorough, let's quickly review. Western academic philosophy has a branch within itself dedicated to answering the question, what is philosophy? It has no agreed upon criteria for doing advanced level work, and the field uses convoluted jargon that no other academic discipline uses nor understands. Yet somehow this meta-discipline is called in as some sort of consultant to clarify the nature and limits of many other disciplines. This doesn't quite jive, right? It doesn't pass muster. The last paragraph of this entire Wikipedia definition states, and I quote, "The idea that philosophy is useful for many aspects of life and society is sometimes rejected. According to one such view, philosophy is mainly undertaken for its own sake and does not make any significant contributions to existing practices or external goals." This is what I call the purpose problem. And right now, I believe that Fred Nietzsche's pants are resoundingly around his ankles. Now I will address what I call the ethnocentric problem. In the last video, I described my personal roller coaster ride studying academic philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the 1990s. Over the years, I continually asked professors, when do we study African American philosophy, Asian American philosophy, or African philosophy, Asian philosophy, and in particular, Native American philosophy? The responses I kept getting were, we study those all the time. But of course, we never did. It wasn't until my senior year when I took a class with my favorite philosophy professor, Professor Claudia Card, in her American philosophy class when she stated philosophy was the study of great white dead men, that we finally studied African American philosophers, Asian American philosophers, Hispanic American philosophers, Jewish American philosophers, Native American philosophers, and women philosophers. This Wikipedia definition and description on philosophy and its accompanying links and associated pages are overflowing with ethnocentric bias. For those unfamiliar, ethnocentric means evaluating all other cultures based upon your own preconceptions coming from your own culture. Now, throughout the Wikipedia entry, we find use of linguistic colonialism. Now, linguistic colonialism are words woven into everyday speech that are so commonplace that most people never give these words a second thought. With certain words come certain ideas, and those ideas are accepted as true and go unquestioned. Linguistic colonialism oversimplifies and belittles tribal cultures and implies an us versus them or superior versus inferior dynamic. In this case, it is civilized versus tribal societies, with the civilized us being superior to the tribal them, meaning tribal people are inferior. We often see words like primitive, prehistoric, stone-aged, hunter-gatherer, primal, undeveloped, ancient, archaic, basic, fundamental, original, or unevolved. Even terms like oral tradition or myth imply not advanced, developed, or false. Compared to societies with a literary tradition or documented history, which of course can never be wrong because it's documented. That's sarcasm. And good luck attempting to convince any non-tribal person that someone from an oral tradition is just as advanced or developed as a person from a culture with a literary tradition. We are always seen as inferior, even though there's evidence to suggest otherwise. Linguistic colonialism devalues and criticizes indigenous people and lifeways, and at worst, it ignores, rejects, and attempts to exterminate them. The Wikipedia definition and description of philosophy, of course, mentions Western philosophy, and then it speaks of 3 non-Western branches of philosophy for consideration. In the history section, it lists these 4, and then it also lists other traditions. The 3 main non-Western branches introduced are Arabic, Persian, Indian, and Chinese. Now, the linguistic colonialism in here is subtle but visible in the reading. Arabic Persian philosophy is reduced to an earlier period in European history when European philosophers were attempting to separate reason from theology. Indian philosophy is reduced to the spiritual problem, which is code for witchcraft and voodoo to the hardcore Western academic philosopher, fixated on intellect at all cost. And 3,000 years of Chinese civilization that produced such things as the Great Wall, paper and printmaking, gunpowder, the compass, and the largest empire ever to cover the entire planet, has been reduced to little more than mundane philosophical thoughts of ethics, according to Western academic philosophy. And yet, when it speaks of its own origins in ancient Greece, it states it covers a wide area of philosophical subfields, meaning it has breadth, it has depth, it has complexity, and a storied history. The ancient Greeks also referred to everyone else in the world who were not Greeks as barbaroi, or barbarians. And so, if the Western world considers ancient Greece to be the birthplace of modern philosophy, it must assume accountability for the fundamental value system of believing the rest of the planet is inferior or barbaroi to them. And thus, this is the birthplace of ethnocentric exclusionary practices, which is evidenced by linguistic colonialism. After the big four philosophical traditions have been listed in Wikipedia's definition and description of philosophy, those being Western philosophy, Arabic, Persian, Indian, and Chinese, we find the entire rest of the world is encapsulated into 3 paragraphs under the section entitled Other Traditions. But not really, right? The entire first paragraph is on Japan. The second paragraph is on North and South America. And the third paragraph is on Africa. I'm going to skip over Japan. With regards to the paragraph on the Americas, the only mention of tribal people of North America is in their relation to the Latin American civilizations of Central and South America. I assure you in future videos I will discuss the bias that civilized people have against tribal people and how I believe the next generation should work toward a synthesis of these two. For the moment, we need to see that civilization comes from the Latin civis, meaning city dweller, or originally a citizen of Rome. Native people living in tribal nations lived close to the earth and thus did not have cities. Europeans were able to relate to square buildings, paved roads, and a literary tradition. This was their tradition, and thus they see Latin Americans as having civilizations vaguely akin to their own. The tribal nations of North America having no civilizations, or none that lasted, thus must be inferior. Even with Latin American civilizations, and despite the Peruvian Empire being hailed by anthropologists as just as sophisticated and complex as the Egyptian Empire, by Western academic philosophical standards, Latin American civilizations had no valuable philosophic thought until they were massacred, raped, enslaved, and influenced by Christianity. But once the indigenous population was colonized, then their only concerns were the philosophy of liberation, that's probably because theirs was taken, and the exploration of identity and culture. And that's probably because they had to rebuild theirs from the ashes. So, from a Western academic philosopher perspective, there's probably really not much to find appealing for them here, right? Though this is crazy native philosophy, I'm going to use Western philosophy's treatment of Africa as supporting evidence. So Wikipedia's 4th paragraph under Other Traditions, right off the bat discusses pre-colonial Africa as an oral tradition and concerned with folklore, wise sayings, religious ideas, and interconnectedness. Without question, this is linguistic colonialism at its finest and displays extreme devaluation. This also sets the superior-inferior dynamic from the very beginning of this paragraph. Now, the 3rd sentence states, systematic African philosophy emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. This paragraph concludes by stating, the philosophy coming out of Africa in the 20th century predominantly was focused on non-European, ethnophilosophy, negritude, Pan-Africanism, cultural identity, African epistemology, post-colonialism, and critiquing Eurocentrism. Now, according to this Wikipedia entry, Africa was a continent with an oral tradition and superstitious beliefs until the 20th century, when philosophical thought began to emerge. But what came out of it was purely African-focused and even anti-European. For an entire academic discipline, that reveres men like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Nietzsche, Locke, Hume, and Kierkegaard, how can philosophers raised in such a tradition consider anything coming out of Africa to be remotely equal or even of interest? Now, according to Western academia overall, the most widely held belief is that all humanity began at one spot in Africa. Now, there are other opposing theories with evidence that isn't explored or is purposefully suppressed, such as humanity began in multiple spots across the globe simultaneously. But for a moment, let's just go with the prevailing belief that humanity began in one spot in Africa. So the Western academic philosophy position is, since the dawn of Australopithecus until the 20th century, there has not been one African capable of philosophic thought in 2.8 million years. I'm going to repeat that. According to Western academic philosophy, there has not been one single African capable of philosophic thought before the 20th century, and every African philosopher since predominantly considers topics relevant only to Africans. Of course, Western academic philosophy seems to have overlooked the Egyptian Empire, which is African. The father of Western academic philosophy is Socrates. Roughly 1,500 years before he was born, Africans had such elaborate mathematics and engineering that they built the greatest structure ever created by our species in the pyramids of Giza. These structures are so advanced that our modern day engineers and scientists are still baffled by their mysteries, including their construction. About the same time as the pyramids were being built, Africans in Egypt were successfully performing brain surgery operations to remove brain cancer. The Egyptian Empire had all of the other trappings of civilization: square buildings, roads, and a hierarchy-tiered social class. Africans were also using papyrus rolls for documentation, approximately 1,500 years before the ancient Greeks even developed their alphabet. But according to Western academic philosophy, for 2.8 million years, from the dawn of Australopithecus to the 20th century, there was not a single philosopher of worthy of note on the entire continent of Africa. I believe this proves my claim of ethnocentric bias. But if this is still not enough, on Wikipedia's definition and description of philosophy, I ask you to look to the bottom. There's a section that says "See also." There is a link there to it says "List of Philosophers." So you click that link, it takes you to another page. We scroll down to lists of philosophers by language or nationality. There we see philosophers listed from European, Arabic Persian, Indian, and Chinese, right? No surprise there. There are also headings for Korean, Russian, Canadian, and American, with a subheading for Jewish, but no other ethnicities listed. Now, there are 7 continents on our planet. 6 of those are populated. To date, and according to the list of noteworthy philosophers presented here, out of the 6 populated continents, almost 4 entire continents have never produced a philosopher worthy of mention. If you still have doubts, name any woman philosopher from any continent at any time in history before the 1940s. Name an African or Spanish-speaking philosopher. So this is not about other races and ethnicities getting a seat at the table. It's about believing that we belong there. This is the ethnocentric problem. I believe I have now demonstrated that the entire field of Western academic philosophy is disordered, confusing, pointless, and self-serving. I have also shown that ultimately its foundation is ethnocentrically biased. Until Western academic philosophy can answer the question, what is philosophy? It is constrained to the same general conception of philosophy as I am. This means it is in no position of authority over me or anyone else for that matter. So, when I claim that I will do native philosophy in a native way, Western academic philosophy is in no position to say I am doing otherwise, as long as I meet the 7 criteria of general conception. In the next video, I will cover the third and final piece of Western academic philosophy, more specifically, the disastrous attempt to insert Native American philosophy into Western academic philosophy. So I wanted to say Wopilatanka, or big thank you for hanging in there with me to the bitter end. This is hopefully the most boring video I'll ever make, but it needed to be done. The next one will be a little better, or hopefully at least a little shorter, and then I can truly let those dogs run and we can do native philosophy in a native way. Oh, Mataki Ase.